joy.
Thanks, Steph. Thanks, Josh. And thanks, Alice. It'd be helpful if you had that passage open in front of you. Because today's got one of those most misused verses of the Bible in it. Youth groups all around the world have used it to say you must not date a non-Christian. Or it's also been used for power plays, to get people to toe the line of the church leadership, or tribal purposes. Only send your kids to Christian schools, or only listen to Christian music, whatever that is, or only watch Christian movies. Don't go into business with someone unless they're Christian. And the verse 14 might have some relevance to some decisions, some of those areas, but it just doesn't mean any of those things in the first place. It comes to us in the middle of this passage in 2 Corinthians, which is not about conforming to some set of moral rules, but about being transformed by the living God to live for him. And that just doesn't happen by obeying rules. If we could live right by following rules, then there'd be no need for Jesus to have come and to die, right? If it was just following rules. So what I want to do today to start off with is to put this verse back into its context. And I've got three kind of context angles. Then I've got 2 points from the passage, okay? That's what we're going to be doing. Firstly, have a look at the immediate context of this verse. Because if you look at it closely, it's stuck between two passages that call on the Corinthians to open up to Paul. It's a sandwich passage, right? Bread, filler, and bread. A sandwich. The bread, first off, chapter 6, verse 13, finishes with these words, open your hearts. And 7:2, that's the other bit of bread. Make room for us in your hearts. The bread, what's the filler? Well, that filler is about not being unequally yoked. Because since the time that Paul founded this church in Corinth, something's happened. It's narrowed their spiritual arteries, constricted their hearts. And the verses that we look at tonight are about how to unblock those spiritual arteries and get rid of the heart constriction. Now, when Paul says unbelievers in verse 14, he can't possibly mean withdraw from all relationships with people who don't follow Jesus, non-Christians. I'll explain that in a minute. But nor does Paul actually ever use the word anywhere in the New Testament for Christians behaving badly. It is a specific reference here to false teachers who've come into the church at Corinth and are teaching something very different to what Paul taught in the first place. Let me see if I can persuade you of this. Keep a finger in chapter 7 and just turn forward a little bit to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4 for a moment. 2 Corinthians 11:4. This is what he says there. Look, if someone comes to you and preaches a Jesus other than the Jesus we preached, or if you receive a different spirit from the spirit you received, or a different gospel from the one you accepted, you put up with it easily enough. They are putting up with a different Jesus, a different spirit. They accepted it from false apostles. Verse 13 in the same chapter, look down. Such people are false apostles, deceitful workers. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 13. Masquerading as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, because Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. It's not surprising, therefore, if his servants also masquerade as servants of righteousness, their end will be what their actions deserve. Do you see what's going on? Did you see it? Behind the false apostles, Paul sees Satan at work. Among their disarming lies, their fine speech, their lovely, deceitful presence. Because, that's what false teachers need to be. They need to be nice people. People who are nice to hang around with. They don't come with a sign around their neck saying, don't listen to me because I'm a false teacher, right? But behind them is Satan, the master of lies. And so he's saying to the Corinthians, do not listen to them, but open your hearts to me. Open your hearts to the genuine gospel again. That is the immediate context. Secondly, when you take into account all of what Paul says in 1 and 2 Corinthians, the apostle cannot possibly mean that we withdraw from all relationships with non-Christians. Now, as far as we know, there are 4 letters written from Paul to the Corinthians, right? What we've got is, this is confusing, so listen. What we've got is 1 and 2 Corinthians, but actually they were 0 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is not the first letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, okay? So I call the letter before that 0 Corinthians, just for, nomenclature. Keep your finger in 2 Corinthians 7. Turn back to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9. Because there's been a problem in the church and the church is over-corrected. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral, or the greedy or swindlers or idolaters. In that case, you'd have to leave the world. But now, I'm writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister, but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater or slanderer, a drunkard or swindler. Do not even eat with such people. What business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. Expel the wicked person from among you. Now, I realise this is going to throw up all kinds of questions. We are going to have a reaction time after the talk. Okay, so if you've got questions, store them up. Don't be afraid to ask them. We'll need a microphone to make that happen as well. But I just want to say, my observation is that we often get this wrong. It's very easy for Christians to get indignant about what those people out there are doing. And all loosey-goosey with what goes on in church. So do read God's word here. It's God's job, not ours, to judge those outside the church. We are meant to associate with everyone, anyone, regardless of what they believe. In fact, not just associate. The broader Bible picture is that Jesus, our Lord, was known, indeed criticised, as the friend of sinners. We're meant to be involved with and hang around sinners. We're supposed to have the most adaptable and flexible lifestyles, to have the most flexible gatherings for the sake of outsiders, to love and share Christ with those who don't yet follow Christ. And you see the principle in 1 Corinthians 9. Sorry for all this flipping. We will get back to 2 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19. This is what Paul says. This is how he sums it up. 1 Corinthians 9:19. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those having the law, to those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. And I do this all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessings. You see what he's saying? It's not a bad strategy for a church, actually, is it? What a tagline. All things to all people to win some. See, the purpose of the Christian life as we live in this world, as we say and show the gospel, the purpose is twofold. For us to treat God properly, to glorify him for who he is, what he's done. And in this world, to show that out. Mission. He brings other people in as we testify to who he is, as we glorify him in the presence of others, as we speak about him and other people hear. See, Paul doesn't, try to get on with other people so they will like him. as if he's some politician who, he needs to win over a few more people. The campaign's going downhill and we've got to really target those people who are undecided. But so that they will trust Jesus, so they will receive Jesus. And God's grace will overflow through him to the world. So if we go back to 2 Corinthians 6, when Paul says, do not be unequally yoked, he cannot mean cut off contact with unbelievers. He's speaking about the false church leaders. But there is a third, wider context of this passage, which I suspect we don't even see most of the time, and that is the context of the Greek culture into which this is written. See, I suspect we just don't get that there had never been a movement like the early Christian church in the history of the world, and there never has been since, actually, either. Greek culture, you see, was all about me. Take the four prime Greek virtues: moderation, wisdom, courage, justice. All sound fantastic, actually. You would probably be a lot nicer to live with if they were kind of your virtues. But just let me point out that they're fundamentally individualistic, right? They're about being able to detach yourself from others and survive in spite of others. They're about self-sufficiency, being strong in yourself. But on the other hand, the gospel is about how God reached out. He took the first step. He sent his son into the world to suffer for us and rescue us. The whole Christian life is about relationship with others. You remember that line, love one another, love your neighbour? Easy to say, but a lifetime to work out. And that takes being aware of our own need and God's great grace to us. And I think it's why Paul has written so much about weakness in this letter. The Greeks just didn't do weakness. And you see, if you have false teachers in the church at that point saying, this fella Paul, the message that he brought, this fella Paul who can't organise his travel schedule, who can't be trusted to do and be somewhere when he says he's going to be there. And, you've heard about all his trouble and being in jail and, being in prison and being, under pressure from the authorities. We're kind of embarrassed about that. Let's just kind of leave him. We don't need him. And actually, even when it comes to Jesus, don't mention his death, right? And the shame and the suffering that he went through there. Like, that's actually not what Jesus is on about. What the false teachers are doing, they're trying to replace that gospel with a gospel of success. We don't need to talk about weakness or suffering or anything like that, because what we want is health and wealth and success and progress and prosperity. And you know what happens when you listen to those teachers? Your heart constricts. And the compassion arteries, they narrow. And look, that's my introduction. And if you're thinking that's not a very good model for preaching, you're probably right. But it is what it is. So I've got two points on the passage now, right? Firstly, the temple invaded, and secondly, the temple cleansed. Because there's been an invasion in the temple of God. A few years ago, my in-laws had a most terrible infestation. It is amazing what some people could live with. They'd be waiting in the cupboards. The cereal boxes, in the morning, they'd fall out of the cereal boxes into your bowl. They'd climb on the dining table during dinner. They'd get into the food while we were getting it ready on the bench. Those terrible little German cockroaches. Sorry if you're German, by the way. I don't know how they got named that. And of course, we only saw the edges of the infestation because the real problem was what we couldn't see. It was behind the cupboards and under the sink and under the floorboards. That's where the infestation was. And this is the purpose of that famous passage, don't be unequally yoked with unbelievers, to make clear what the Corinthians perhaps have not seen in their church. It's meant to be a slap in the face It's meant to be a breaking point, a watershed moment for them. A yoke is a wooden beam that binds two working animals together in agrarian cultures into an engine. In the Old Testament, God said, don't put an ox and a donkey together in a yoke, because they're different power sources. Well, actually, there's a lot of reasons for you. Maybe you want to ask me about that later. But one of the things is they're different power sources, and they kind of go around in circles, and they won't work together, right? But it's not just like the Sesame Street issue. You know, one of these things is not like the other ones. But it's because there's a kind of enmity and inherent incompatibility. You put it inside the engine, it'll destroy it. But you see, the Corinthians didn't think they were yoked together with unbelievers. And that is how scams work, isn't it? 2022, the ACCC Scam Watch tells us that 3.1 billion Australian was lost to scams. An 80% increase on 2021. And you might say, well, that wasn't me. Well, it's got to be somebody. And that's just the scams where, one, the people knew they were scammed, and two, they reported it rather than keeping it hidden because they were so ashamed, right? If you've ever been scammed, you know what I mean. And clearly the Corinthians had not seen what was at stake when they welcomed in and accepted the false teachers. And you know, I wonder if we're the same. Whether it's easy for us to get sucked in by people who look Christian, who have the label Christian teacher, but actually are on about a totally different gospel. In verses 14 to 16, there are 6 short questions, all like kind of links of a chain, all expecting the answer none, which lead to the climax, the last one about incompatible worship. The first one's there in verse 14. What partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? And he's not talking about moral performance, that somehow Christians are always sinless. The word's lawlessness. And what he's saying is that we're kidding ourselves if we think we can have righteousness but not submit to God. We can have righteousness and just kind of be in charge of our lives. We can have righteousness and do whatever we want. You know, lust after many possessions. We can have righteousness and hide our porn addiction away in our hearts. Because if I do that, then what I'm showing is I'm trying to replace God as lawmaker. I'm making up what it's okay to be like and to follow. We have been saved by Jesus from living as if we're God to now submitting to Christ as our Lord, which means master. That's what Lord means. Second question, verse 14. What fellowship can light have with darkness? None. They can't coexist. Turn the light on and the dark goes, right? And the light that God has brought into our hearts drives out shadow. But if we love shadow? Third question, verse 15. What accord is there between Christ and Belial? None. Belial is a Jewish word for Satan, who hates God and does everything he can to destroy God's work, yet he goes around pretending to be an angel of light. Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? Nothing. I mean, on the outside, you look at people walking down the street, all the same. You can't tell by looking at people who's a believer and who's not. Where one person believes that everything worth having comes to us through Jesus Christ, and the other doesn't. And then the last one, verse 16. What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. See, ultimately Paul regards this as an issue of worship. Now, in the New Testament, worship is not less than what we do in church, but it is certainly much more. It's what we do in our whole lives. Is what we do, what we express in the formal setting of church, sure. But since the God we worship is the God of heaven and earth, who doesn't sleep or grow weary, who's made us to be his treasured possession, not just 1 hour a week, the way we live all of life is worship of him. But you know, it's not just us who worship, not just us who are religious. God has made humans to worship. Humans cannot not worship. We only worship different gods. My atheist friends who laugh at me for what I believe, I'm glad to see that I'm a source of pleasure for them. That's great. But you know, they worship something. It's often themselves, or their rationalisms, or someone else's rationalism, or other people's respect and approval. You know, when the Bible speaks about what we worship, it's speaking primarily about affairs of the heart, what we love. One of the best ways to understand this is just thinking about the first commandment. God's brought the people out of Egypt. He's brought them to himself, the mountain. He says, I'm the Lord your God who's brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You'll have no other gods but me. What is it to have a God? Well, it's something we look to for what's good. And it can be something very good in itself. It might be marriage. I so value my marriage. Kathy was away this week. Sorry, just plug your ears for a minute. Man, it was good when she came back. I'll tell you. It could be marriage, or a job, or success in business or study. It could be my team winning at football, not Manly this year, or it might be buying something, or the approval of others. It might be getting thin or fit. Just imagine. But if we begin to love that thing more than we love God, it becomes an idol. If it takes God's place, if it's more important to my view of myself than God is, then it's become an idol. The two biggest idols we know about from Corinth were sex and money. And the New Testament says greed is idolatry. Greed. Wanting more, wanting to possess, sexual greed, wanting to possess someone else. And if we yoke ourselves to those idols, we'll be controlled by something other than God. And I just want to say this is really hard for us, because we, like Corinth, live in a highly sexualised society. I mean, it's just really obvious when you go to another culture, especially a majority world culture. We live in a Tinder world. Porn sites available on all our devices, all around us. And your money, and therefore you, are increasingly shaped by the psychology of marketing and consumerism. It's not enough to sell today by meeting a need. You know this, don't you? Marketing today is all about creating the need, by working on my dissatisfaction and my idols and feeding them with false answers so that my very identity comes from consuming who I am. I am what I am because of my clothing label or the car I drive or my handbag and all the rest. And I value things according to that yoke. And what this does to relationships is that gradually other people stop having the value that God gives them. And they've only got value for what they can do for me. I'm at the centre. I replace God. And the same happens with our relationship with God. No longer is being in his presence our satisfaction. He's got to give me something. My question for God becomes, what can you do for me today to make life better right now? We're only really in it for what God can give me, not for God himself. And, you know, this is the question. The mindset of the prosperity gospel preaching that's infected so much of Africa, but it's a Western problem. And if Paul was writing to us today, I wonder, would he say, what part does love have with consumerism? Or what fellowship has faith with pornography? But he's not writing directly to us, is he? He's writing to the Corinthians, where there's an infestation of the temple of God. But you know, I see echoes of it in myself and in us. And if you're feeling conviction about this, I need to say this is something that all of us struggle with. I found in my own life, as I get older, it's easy to trade the obvious idols for the less obvious, and disrespectable idols for the respectable ones. My second point, the cleansing of the temple. How are we going to cleanse the temple? Well, the only thing that has the power to cleanse the temple of the living God are the promises of God. It won't happen by your, being more obedient or, more passionate or, trusting him more. Only he can cleanse you. The word temple that Paul uses here is the special dwelling place of God. I just want you to stop for a moment and imagine how crazy this would have sounded to this marginalised church in Corinth, where they were very much on the outer end of the city, especially the ones who've come back to Paul already and saying no to the false teachers. But Paul's saying, you are the special ones. You're where God dwells. One of the takeaways from this for us, I think, is that the Corinthian church and us, every genuinely Christian church, are not just another gathering playing a social service role. We are the dwelling place of God on earth, the place where his glory rests. And it's not something we're going to become, it's something that we are, based on God's promises. Look at verse 16 to 18. There Paul pulls together a number of Old Testament quotes and shows how God is fulfilling those quotes now in and through the Christians in Corinth. I will live with them and walk among them and I'll be their God. They will be my people, is what he promised in the Old Testament. They come from two separate times in the Old Testament. And the first was when Israel was gathered around God at Sinai and Moses spoke to them and they got the law. But the second is much, much later in the Old Testament when Israel's been unfaithful and God has abandoned the temple in Jerusalem and Israel's in slavery in Babylon and Ezekiel and Isaiah. The promises get bigger and bigger. I will be a father to you and you'll be my sons and daughters, says the Lord. As it is with God always, the restoration is so much more than what we lost. God adopts us as his children and becomes our Father. And then comes 7:1. Therefore, since we have these promises, dear friends, let us purify ourselves from everything that contaminates body and spirit, perfecting holiness out of reverence for God. See, it's God's promises. It's only God's promises that have got the power to remove idols and their power over us. Because the way that idols work is that they make promises to us, but they are always false promises. And the idols are never able to fulfill the promises. I looked at some consumer idols this week. Starbucks, to inspire and nurture the human spirit. One person, one cup, and one neighbourhood at a time. Sure, they use more than 8,000 non-recyclable cups a minute. And their coffee's rubbish. Or Weet-Bix. You never knew this. Sanitarium. Eat well. Live well. Really? You can get Weet-Bix in prison. Or the one from 10 years ago. Volkswagen, 2013. The group's goal is to offer attractive, safe and environmentally sound vehicles which can compete in an increasingly tough market and set world standards in their respective class. World standards in fuel consumption deception. And if your God is the approval of others, that's one of my idols, you quickly become a slave. If your idol's being physically attractive or famous, it's gonna eat you alive. Yoke yourself to those things, they'll destroy you. But God stands behind his promises. They are trustworthy because he says he will do them. And our hearts are continually tugging us away from him. Our hearts are restless. We lose sight of his promises. We attach to other things. What we need to do is to take God's promises and shine their light on our idols. This is, I think, maybe the most important takeaway today. The promises of God, they come in order to effect our cleansing. as his promises are brought to bear on our lives, they show up the false idols. It's not that I've got to get rid of our idols, I've got to stop doing that, otherwise God won't be my Father, or otherwise he won't forgive me. But because he already is my Father, and he promises me, you'll be my children, I'll be your Father, that we shine that light on our lives. Like Jesus says, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. I said there'd be a bit of time for questions or reactions. Part of my vision for this time of church is not just a kind of, ask the chat and get an answer. There might be some way that God has spoken to you tonight, and we actually ought to come prepared when we come to church to encourage others to give testimony to how he's been at work. And it might be that something that I've said or something that we've read has sparked a connection for you in that. And now's the time for you to give a reaction, but it might be that you've got a question as well. That was really just filling in the time till we got our microphones. Questions or comments? There's one.
Thanks, Tim. That was really encouraging and helpful. I guess my question is, you said that if we begin to love God, if we begin to love that thing more than God, it's becoming an idol. And I guess this is more of a practical question, or maybe you could flesh it out a little bit more. Do you have any tips or advice, like how do we live in this world, especially in like one of the wealthiest suburbs in Australia, or being here as a church? And how do we enjoy the things of this world that God's given us, like good gifts like marriage, and a lot of us are quite wealthy, I think, as well, just living in Sydney, and how do we enjoy those things without making them an idol and get the balance right? Because it's easy to steer from one extreme to the other, but how do you navigate balancing that? Yeah.
There's a bunch of ways we could spend all the rest of tonight talking about that, and maybe that's what we need to talk about over Connect Dinner. But here's two things. Chapter 5, verse 21. This is maybe, the verse in 2 Corinthians to mull over and to write above your door or something like that. 5:21. For our sake, he made him to be sin. For our sake, God made Jesus to be sin, him who knew no sin, the perfect one, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. The methodology of being transformed so that we love God and we love what he loves, that's why he saved us, right? So that we go from hating him or ignoring him to loving him and loving what he loves, hating him and ignoring him and just wanting the stuff that he made, to loving him and loving what he loves with the stuff he's made. How that happens is as we see Jesus, as we look at Jesus, right? Through him, we become the righteousness of God. So that's the simple programmatic answer. Every other answer is an application of that answer. But one of the applications of that, I think, is what we read in 1 Corinthians chapter, was it 5:19? Oh, no, it wasn't. It was 10, wasn't it? Was it 10? Where did I read before? 9, thank you. 9 verse 19. This is not my Bible, and it's so irritating because I can't find what I want to find. And using electronic Bible now, it never looks the same anyway. Look, 1 Corinthians 9:19. Though I am free from all, I've made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. The basic stance of the Christian is freedom, right? It might be that I don't know. You like marathons. I can't understand it myself. They're very annoying. But it might be that you like it. Well, you know what? You're free to do that. You're free to love that. That's fine. That's fine. The basic stance of the Christian is we're free. I'm not your master, and you're not my master. Jesus is your master, right? And he's died for you to bring you freedom. And what does Paul do with that freedom, right? He's been freed from being under God's judgment to now being able to stand in front of God on the judgment day. He says, I use my freedom to make myself a servant to all, that I might win some more of them. See, that's what loving God and loving what God loves looks like. What does God love? On the night that Jesus was betrayed, you know what he prayed? Father, take this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will. Because he loved what the Father loved more than his own life. And I don't know about you, but that devastates me, because my heart's not like that. My heart's cold, and I'm so easily dragged away to other things, to love other things and other people. Yeah. Free, so use your freedom to love him and love what he loves. He'll change you. Ask him.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions or comments? Sorry, that was a bit longish, but...
Thanks, Tim. That was helpful. You mentioned this section isn't about like not going into business with unbelievers or that kind of thing, or marrying unbelievers. But I wonder, like, is there still wisdom, or would it still kind of include that? Like if you were working with all unbelievers, or...
So the way God's word works is that through the gospel, we're brought into freedom. Right? And so we need to be really careful that we don't suddenly elevate everything the Bible says to a kind of the highest level, because in the freedom that we have, we now understand how God has made the world. And God made the world with wisdom at his right hand. You know, there's a reason why scientific inquiry works, and there's a reason why science flourished in one place at one time in history. And you might want to take me on about that, but basically, after people understood that Christians are free and to inquire into how the world works, and it's a good thing, and it's honouring to God to do that. That saw the flourishing of science in Western Europe. But that's not the same as the gospel. What they've discovered is how the world works. And the Bible calls that wisdom. You know, wisdom is something simple like don't walk in front of a bus, because you won't win that one, right? Wisdom is as simple as listen to your parents. I'm sure there's a verse in the Bible about that. I could dig it out. But you know what I'm getting at. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in figuring out whether your goals align with close partners' goals. So this week, we bought a unit. Right? We engaged a buyer's agent. And I was really impressed. The reason I engaged him finally was because he spent the first hour with me exploring what it is that we wanted to buy this unit for. What is our purpose and vision? And it's just, it's not as if it's breaking a rule to get into business with somebody who's not a follower of Jesus. It's just that you're going to find at key points you're going in different directions. Somebody shared with me about this morning. They're in a business with somebody where they were asked every day, it was Friday night actually, every day in business they are asked to falsify insurance documents. the value of a certain thing. And they're in business with somebody who's not a believer. And fortunately, in that situation, that person actually has the same value of honesty, and they wouldn't do something that's really easy to do to make more money. Right? My guess is that isn't going to be the case most of the time. So you are introducing difficulties when you do that, but it's not a rule. It's wisdom. Yeah. Great question. Thank you. Thank you, Bella. Yeah. One more. Okay. Oh, there was one. Sorry. My peripheral vision is still okay.
Thank you for your encouragement, Tim. I might just nuance Bella's question slightly because mine was kind of the same. In your sermon, you pivoted not being unequally yoked with unbelievers to not being unequally yoked with idols for present-day Christians. Is there an application of this passage before the pivot? So kind of like Bella asked,
There is.
not being unequally yoked with unbelievers, but in the sense that is there a specific group of false teachers in the capital C church that we need to be not unequally yoked with?
Yep. So the reason we spend so much... Oh, should I restate that question? I said a lot about what not to do, how not to be unequally yoked. What is the positive? I think is another way of putting your nuance. Now I guess what I want to say is the reason we spend so much time here reading the Bible, talking about the Bible, listening to the Bible, discussing the Bible, even asking God to help us to obey what he says, is because this is how we access Paul the Apostle. You know, he's been appointed by God, by Jesus, to bring the gospel to the world, to the non-Jewish world. The false apostles have made up their gospel. But the way we access God's gospel is through the scriptures, which he's preserved for us. That's a whole other kind of question. That's partly why I didn't kind of do that thing. And you might want to ask me more about that later. But I think that's the means by which we get to don't do idols. Because looking to other sources of authority, that is an idol. That's letting other things occupy God's position. Yeah. Thanks, Riley. That's a very helpful clarification. Thank you, Alice.
Tim just pointed out chapter